Anyway, what I'd actually suggested I'd be talking about this afternoon is my recent trip, and it's the second trip in 2 years to South Africa. I'm working on a book for the American Freedom Party called, we don't have a title yet, but the theme is The Ongoing White Genocide in South Africa. Now, that may sound a little over the top. You know, genocide, well, you'll say, well, I haven't read in the paper massacres on the streets and so on. And that's true. You haven't. But there's a man named Stanton. He's a liberal. He heads up something called Genocide Watch in Virginia. And he visited South Africa in November of 2014. And he said South Africa is in the 6th of the 7 stages of genocide. In other words, it is the stage before you have people being machine gunned or macheted in the streets. He said there is an organized, ongoing campaign to exterminate the white people there, or to make their living conditions impossible, so that they either accept death or die or leave. Now that comes not from a, whatever you want to call him, a right-winger or a white nationalist, but that comes from a man with very established liberal credentials. So that's really what sparked the interest of the American Freedom Party to send me to South Africa. And I went in May of 2015, and I went again in August of this year to complete my research. And I'd be the first one to say I feel a little inadequate, because I think a total of 1 month in a country doesn't make you an expert. But I was not there to party or have a good time or visit Kruger National Park or be on the beach or anything like that. It was pretty steady work and interviews, and I was very lucky to have people who organized things for me, who organized good people. I wasn't just blundering down the street asking people their opinions. I was able to talk to a lot of experts, some people who'd been assaulted, other people who knew people who'd been murdered. So I got a lot of good information, and I was able to compare it with my memories of being in South Africa in 1987 under very different conditions. So I'm now feverishly working away on the book. So what did I discover? Well, one of the things that, first of all, some figures. Since 1994, and that's when, under American and British and Canadian pressure, the ruling party of South Africa sold out, essentially, and turned power over to the communists and the African National Congress. And I'm saying, using those terms deliberately. It was a turnover of power to the communists. The African National Congress has worked closely with the SAPC, that's the South Africa Communist Party, for going back into the 1930s. Unlike almost any other country in the world, other than perhaps Cuba or North Korea or maybe China, the Communist Party is very strong in South Africa. The present Prime Minister, Jacob Zuma, is a communist, a member of the Communist Party. The sainted Nelson Mandela that you would have read about in our papers were just Mandela groupies. Even for Alberta Premier Alison Redford had gone to South Africa and worked with Mandela. Harper was a big backer of Mandela. Mulrooney was a big fan. He had a huge reputation, but he was a communist. And he served a lot of time in jail, not because of his political beliefs, but because he'd been involved in organized terrorism. So he was a terrorist. Anyway, so power was handed over to the African National Congress, and essentially that's the Communist Party in South Africa in 1994. From 1994 until today, close to 70,000 whites have been murdered. That is about the number of soldiers the Americans lost in Vietnam. 70,000 in a war that's never been declared. South Africa is one of the most violent countries in terms of murder on earth. It's not the most violent. I think that's Honduras. My God. But it is one of the most violent. I've been told that South Africa is actually more dangerous than Iraq. That really is saying something. Murders are absolutely out of control in South Africa. Most of the victims, to be fair, are blacks killing blacks, just like what goes on in the United States and in places like where I come from, Toronto. But whites are also frequently the victims, and that's quite a death toll in 22 years. 70,000 whites murdered. Over 3,000 white farmers murdered. And
there's one question.
Yes.
In America, aren't there more than that murdered in the same time? Like there's a statistic which claims 14,000 people around that are murdered in America every year.
Well, that may be true, but
So if I take that time to 20 years you're talking about, that's 250,000.
Although America, of course, is over 300 million people, South Africa's about 60 million. And then when I'm talking about the murders, that's only whites. Blacks murder blacks quite frequently in South Africa. So, very considerable pains to protect themselves. It's particularly dangerous in rural areas because often the police, even if they're called, will not arrive for 20 minutes, half an hour, by which time the intruders have murdered, raped, robbed, and moved on. So physical security seems to be almost the number one preoccupation of the whites I met. You drive through nice communities. Every place is surrounded by quite a high wall or just plain fencing and with razor wire on the top, or electrified wire. Most places have some form of surveillance security. They're linked up to a security company. They've got sensors on the windows and the doors. Some have video cameras inside. Security is a major concern for people, even people who live in what we might call gated communities. The problem is, or one problem is, the blacks are everywhere for reasons that are certainly hard for me to understand and probably hard for you to understand. Many whites insist on having blacks do work for them, and that means that they're able to get close to them. Now the blacks they themselves hire may be honest people, but people talk. And I met one woman who had gone through 10 years of hell and surgeries, and she had been she'd driven up to her home late one afternoon after work, and opened the garage, drove her car into the garage, and then she got out of her car. A shadow came at her and she thought, punching her. And she tried to protect herself with her handbag. And then she screamed. Her maid came along. The maid screamed, and the intruder ran around the side of the house and ran away with the maid in pursuit. But she called her maid back. She didn't want her to get hurt. Well, she staggered out into the driveway, and she began to feel faint. And the maid then came back screaming that there's blood everywhere. They screamed for the neighbor. Neighbor came along, and by this time the woman had almost fainted. She's lying down on the driveway pavement, and she looked down. She realized that it hadn't been punches that she'd been blocking or trying to block with her handbag, but knife thrusts. And that her arms were all slashed up. She probably saved her life with the handbag. Anyway, many more details to the story, but She went to hospital. She has taken about 8 years to get back any mobility in I think it's the left arm. The nerves were slashed, the muscles were slashed, and she's been through endless painful surgeries, and you know, it has blighted her life. They eventually caught the guy, and he had been told that there might be things worth stealing in that house, not by her maid, but by the maid of a neighbor who told her boyfriend, and the boyfriend turned out to be a thief. So that is a reality many of the South Africans live with, that they have blacks working closely in their houses as maids or garden boys or whatever, and you know, people see things. They see what you have, and so on. So the fear is a constant in these people's lives. This report's only a week old, but I guess the week that ended last Sunday, there were 670 some burglaries of whites in South Africa. Property is an obvious target. They will steal cell phones, obviously they'll steal cash. Computers are a big target, and there are organized rings organized by Nigerians. The Nigerians seem to have a bad reputation wherever they go, whether it's the United States or internet scams or credit card scams or South Africa. There's a considerable criminal element of Nigerians in South Africa that have things quite well organized. They'll steal computers on command. Somebody in a neighboring country would like such and such a model of computer. They'll just organize one of their local blacks to go and steal such a thing. And there are truckloads of stolen and scrubbed computers that are shipped up to places like Zimbabwe or Malawi or Mozambique and so on. So, and of course, that's almost entirely whites who are the victims. I was also told by one man whose area is computer security and protection that some of the computers are stolen and end up in black school boards. In other words, the criminals steal the computers, sell them to the government, whether the government realizes it or not, and then they're distributed in the schools. So whites are under constant pressure in terms of their own physical safety. Just as in America, there are certainly areas that you really wouldn't go, even if you have a gun. The precautions I saw taken, the person who drove me around in Durban never stopped at a stop sign, day or night. Well, actually, we're hardly ever out at night, but never in a day, even in Tony neighborhoods. Like, you know, we sometimes in Canada do what's called a cruising stop. You kind of slow down, but you never actually put the brake on. Oh, this person didn't do that, would take a quick look and zip through the stop sign. And I finally asked why. I mean, I wasn't worried. I didn't think that this person was a bad driver or anything. And this person informed me, that is when you're most vulnerable. You stop at a stop sign and they're likely to jump out from behind a wall or a bush day or night. They'll smash the window. If you're lucky, all they'll do is try to steal your handbag or your cell phone if it's out. But they may also try to hijack the car. It's not worth it. The driver told me they would rather take their chances, as long as there doesn't seem to be oncoming traffic, take their chances and go right through that stop sign. That's kind of an interesting strategy. And that's the way life is. Constant worry about security. You can imagine what that does to the cost of living. If something that you pretty much have to have, unless you're dirt poor, is security. an electrified fence, an electronic monitoring system, a company that will rush to your aid if the alarm goes off. Yeah, all that costs. That's something you have to build in. It also means that that your property insurance is quite pricey because there are so many thefts. The insurance companies have to cover those. Well, of course, that's not covered out of charity or the goodness of their hearts. That's covered through premiums. So that aspect of the cost of living is quite high for people. So there's the physical threat. In the Revolutionary War to try to overthrow the whites prior to 1994, the African National Congress had one of these militant songs called "One Bullet, One Boer." Now, Boer is the Afrikaans word for farmer, but it was also kind of the general term for whites, or at least the Afrikaner whites. And so one bullet, one Boer. So the idea was go out and kill the farmers. Well, that idea has continued, and it still receives encouragement from the very top of the government. The present communist president, Jacob Zuma, has been seen in recent times even dancing and singing the words to that song, "One Bullet, One Boer." So many of the blacks see an okay from the top to attack farmers. They attack them for a number of reasons. One is, in many cases, they're fairly isolated and therefore fairly vulnerable. And there is also a hatred that is spawned by the communist ideology, and part of that hatred is that the whites, particularly the farmers, stole their land. This is not true. South Africa was not a black inhabited country when the whites first came in the 1480s, except for the area where the whites first landed in the Cape, around Cape Town. It was largely empty. There were people that were the ancestors of what we would call the Hottentots who were there. When the whites first had contact with them, a lot of them died off because of smallpox. They were very vulnerable to that. And there was a lot of intermarrying. Now, when the first batch of whites to come were the Portuguese, the next batch were the Dutch. When the Dutch were on their way around the Cape to their holdings in what's now Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, and India, and so on and so on. And then came Huguenot religious refugees from France. That's why so many of these South African names sound French, like Du Toit, De Beer, and so on. And then the British came, and by the middle part of the 19th century, there was quite a good deal of conflict between the Dutch, French, they're now spoken a new language called Afrikaans, these folks, and the British. That they wanted more independence, they didn't want to be under British rule, so they began to push north from the Cape into what's now the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. At the same time that whites were beginning to push north, blacks from what's now Rhodesia were beginning to push south. So blacks and whites basically got into the same territory at about the same time. So the whites didn't steal the territory from the blacks, and quite often whites, the Afrikaners, made treaties with black tribes that were in the area. So okay, we have this land, you have that land. So it was not as the communist ideology has tried to instruct a lot of young blacks. Somehow farmers should be a legitimate target because they stole their land from you. Interesting things have, but that's you see where the communist ideology, it really gets in the way of any sort of progress. Okay, so whites are under physical threat, but almost as bad is the economic threat. And here's again where communist ideology comes in. The South African government has a ruthless policy called the BEE, and that stands for Black Economic Empowerment Program. You know, superficially it sounds good. You know, give the blacks more of a chance to have jobs and, you know, start businesses and do well and all those good things. But in fact, what BEE is what the Americans would call affirmative action. What we in Canada call employment equity. It means special privileges for some. So, as here in Canada, you know, if you're a sexual minority, a visible minority, a Native Indian, and sometimes if you're a woman, you get special preference for hiring or for advancement. You know, so basically it's anti-white discrimination. Well, the BEE is affirmative action on steroids. In South Africa, government is big, not just you know, the government departments like education and health and so on, but also what are called parastatals. These are what we would call crown corporations. Eskom is the big electrical generating entity in South Africa. It's huge and very badly administered. The whites left them a thriving power producing network that they exported power to all sorts of neighboring countries in Africa. Well, because of affirmative action, incompetent blacks or blacks who were connected politically got appointed to executive positions, positions that they were in many cases not competent to be in. All sorts of dreadful mistakes, technical mistakes, generators blowing up because somebody had done something wrong. It's a mess. But anyway, something like Eskom is big. So if you're a small business and you are trying to sell your goods or services, you cannot deal with the government or with any of the parastatals unless you are BEE compliant. Now what that means is that at least 75% of your workforce must be black. Well, let's take a hypothetical. Let's say I'm a textbook publisher. So I want to sell my textbooks to the school boards in, let's say, Cape Town. My company must be BEE compliant. That means my writers, my editors, my staff, 75% must be black. You know, whether they're competent or not. But not only that, but my suppliers must be BEE compliant. So the company that prints the textbooks for me, they've got to be 75% black minimum. And the shipping company that takes the textbooks from the printer to take them to the Board of Education, they've got to be BEE compliant. Now, in conditions like that, it's very hard for whites to get a job, especially young whites, with the result that a great number of people I met, older people, I'd ask, oh, how are your children? Oh, they're doing well. Oh, where are they? Oh, they're in Germany. Or they're in Australia. Or they're in England. Or, in other words, the United Nations, in its discussion of description of genocide, talks not just about, you know, massacring people in the streets as genocide, but creating conditions where people cannot survive. Well, if they're not allowed to work, they can't survive. And South Africa does not have much of a welfare system, which brings me to one of the saddest things that I've ever seen, and that is homeless camps for whites. There is substantial homelessness. Whites who have lost their home, they don't have a home. And normally what has happened, and this is particularly for working class people. You may have been I met a man like this. He was quite a good electrician. and he worked for a company for many years, but the company had to let him go because they needed to hire more blacks. So here he is in his mid-50s, he's let go. Well, he can no longer make the payments on his house. After some months, he has to give his house up. He's now living in a car with his wife. After a while, can no longer maintain the car. So where do they live? Well, he was found by a pub owner I met. He thought there was a guy sleeping in his bathroom. This pub had a washroom out back, kind of a concrete structure. You went down some stairs, and not very big. And he kind of thought that, he got the idea that maybe somebody was staying there overnight. So one night, I think he came back late and opened the door, and here's this 55-year-old man kind of scrunched up around the toilet. This is the only place he has to sleep. Anyway, this story has a happy ending. He found him as a position at a nearby camp for homeless white people. And with his fellow skills, he was able to do a lot of necessary work around the camp. And eventually, some months later, he did find him a job. But this is a story with a happy ending. But you wonder, well, how does a person get into that condition? Well, if you can't find a job, and you can no longer make payments on your house, well, you lose your house. You have no income coming in. How do you live? Well, that's the position substantial number of whites find themselves in. I have not been able to, in my own mind, come up with a satisfactory number. If you ask, well, how many whites are in that condition? I've been told 800,000, which I think is probably excessive. But there are, the one person I dealt with who raises money and food and household products for people in these camps, deals with 16 camps and says among them there'd be at least 4,000 or 5,000 whites that are homeless. And the government will do absolutely nothing for them. These are people who basically have no place to stay and no income, or in some cases they have an income, but it's completely inadequate. If in one camp I met a white woman with 5 children. Her husband actually has a job, but because of discrimination, he is, he's basically minimum wage. So he has to make the decision: do we have a place to stay, or do we have food? And not very much of it. Well, food was seen more important, and that's why they ended up in this homeless. It's basically a farmer's field where they build their own shelters as best they can. And the organization that I was that showed me around, the South Africa Family Relief Society, tries to bring food, clothes, whatever is necessary, whatever these people need. And it's the stories are pathetic. This woman I met, she's was the mother of these 5 children. I would say she's probably in her mid-30s. She would, under better conditions, be quite a good-looking woman. She had hardly any teeth, and just bedraggled, worn out, and yet she looked like that very famous picture. You've probably seen it. It's a black and white picture from the Depression days in the United States. Some woman, I think, with a child from Oklahoma. That worn out, almost hopeless look. And that is the lot that substantial numbers of white people face. On this last trip, I went to a place it's called Muncieville, which is near Pretoria, and it's a homeless camp that was built on a former trash heap. It's like a garbage dump, and the town council didn't want whites living there, so they passed an ordinance that they could only build a concrete wall a meter high. But the Afrikaners are a pretty resourceful lot. So, okay, they build the beginning of a wall a meter high, and then they build on top of that with wood or with a wire wire framework, and then they plaster the wire framework to make a wall. There are five hand pumps for 150 people. There are no toilets, there are outdoor toilets, that's all. Meanwhile, right across the street are houses that the government has built for Negroes. They're serviceable little concrete houses with a TV satellite dish on top, a solar panel, I guess, to heat the water, running water, and indoor toilets. They'll do nothing for the whites. If it weren't for charitable whites helping one another, I mean, these people would starve to death. The children that came running up to greet the person who was in charge of the South Africa Family Relief Project, her name is Lee Oxley Duprea. These people in the camps just love this woman because she and her husband, they're always being called or texted because of some emergency, and they always try to respond, even though they themselves are very poor people. But they try to gather foodstuffs or clothing or furniture, and you see, I saw these little white kids running up to embracing her, all blonde little kids, but many of them with really horrible skin. I'm not sure what would have caused it, but red, inflamed, infected skin. I mean, this is real poverty, and that's being inflicted on the whites in the hopes that either they'll simply die or will leave. And that is the long-range goal of the communists and of the blacks who are in power. Now, South Africa, that's the negative side. I talked, though, to people who said, as bad as things are, I want to try to stay here because this is my country. I have lived in England, or another one told me I've been in Australia for 5 or 6 years, and this really is home to me. And I think most of us would feel this way about Canada. I mean, I don't want to go and live in Mexico, although I know some of the people come to our meetings too, but I don't want to live in Mexico. I don't want to go to Guatemala, even though Guatemala might be cheaper or whatever. I mean, this is my country. And that's the way a number of the whites feel. And they're not immigrants. And that's another thing I think a lot of North Americans don't realize. These aren't people who came out as colonialists, 10 years ago, 20, 30, 50 years ago, and to somebody else's land. Almost all these people were born in South Africa. This is their home. This is where they came from. So many are very reluctant to leave. But the lack of economic opportunity is a huge problem, especially for their children. This is the big worry. Well, if your children can't stay, as a society, you're on your way out. But by the time, if you're in your 50s, if your grown children have to go abroad to work, give another 20, 30 years, you'll be in your grave, and that's the end of your community. That is what the people in South Africa are fighting. Now, there's a lot more I could tell you, but I'll just conclude with a couple of things. As has been the observation of communists everywhere, they're total hypocrites. Jacob Zuma, the president, is a communist. He's a man with some very unusual sexual ideas. He believes he's a man with a grade 5 education. He's a cunning man, but a stupid man. And he has, I believe, 5 wives and numerous girlfriends. And he said, oh no, you won't get AIDS. All you have to do is take a shower afterwards. Well, AIDS is rampant in South Africa among the blacks. And anyway, Zuma, he's a communist. That's supposed to mean, sharing the wealth and all those things. Well, he has his own presidential palace, which is the residence of the South African president, provided by the government in Cape Town. But he also has his own mansion built entirely by taxpayers' money back in his home province of we used to call it Zululand, it's now KwaZulu-Natal, but anyway, over there. It cost $27 million to build, and it's called Nkandla. And one of the, it's not so much a joke, but an observation I heard about the blacks is from Amandla to Nkandla. Amandla was the Xhosa word for power, which was the sort of the slogan of the Communist African National Congress. And so they used to pump their fists and go, Amandla, Amandla, power. Well, from black power to Nkandla, corruption. There's corruption everywhere. And one of the things that worried the security people, cars being pulled over by the police and hijacked by policemen and robbed. There's quite an interesting one of a Chinaman, a visitor from, I think he was a visitor from China with a big Mercedes, and the police pull him over and they're robbing him. And his wife is escapes. She's running across a patch of grass, screaming for help. And it's the police that were pulling off the robbery. This is what the people from one of the security companies said to me. That in some places there's quite a bit of cooperation between the criminal element and the police. So the police, who used to be quite competent when the whites were in charge, are now in some cases corrupt or incompetent or discouraged. One policeman told me, we're outgunned. These people, these criminals, have better weapons than we do. White people who are in the police force realize they have very little chance of advancement. So competent whites end up just putting in time. Well, there's no point in exerting yourself. You'll never rise any higher because all the senior officers have to be, or usually are black. So this is incredibly demoralizing and discouraging. So as I said, there's a lot more I could answer. So what conclusions can we draw from this? Well, one of the things that the American Freedom Party really wants to do is on the assumption that Donald Trump is elected, and I think that becomes a better and better chance with each day. Trump is a reader. Trump is an independent thinker. If Trump would take an interest in the whites in South Africa, it wouldn't even have to be a big public interest. A couple of phone calls could tell the thugs in charge of the South African government to smarten up or else, and I don't think we have to spell out the or else. We're also hoping that if more whites in other parts of the world, like Canada, Europe, and so on, took a greater interest and made this an issue. There was one enterprising fellow on the internet about a year ago who put up a petition saying that European governments should allow any white who wants to leave South Africa to welcome them as a refugee because they are persecuted and they're fellow Europeans, and we shouldn't be too fussy as to, well, your family hasn't lived in Holland for 300 years, or your family hasn't lived in France since Louis XIV, or not, this shouldn't matter. So there are things like that that we can do, and I think we should do. Anyway, that's my story. Are there any questions?
I had a question about what you were saying way back earlier. You were talking about the hate laws. I think that's really significant that you're saying it's based upon junk science from the 1960s, basically. So, because like on my YouTube videos, I have this troll, Bruce Wilson in Montreal, and he's always saying, no, this is a hate crime, and you got to watch over these hate laws, and he's always referencing this. So I guess with regard to vulnerable minorities, you're calling the Jews, for instance, in Canada, a vulnerable minority. So this is all nonsense because people have the right to object to something's wrong. They have to object to what they're doing. So it's just completely natural to object to it. So the whole thing of hate is junk science, right?
Well, the supposed harm caused by hate propaganda is the report that was done on that in 1965 is junk. It's nonsense. It just doesn't it just doesn't describe the way people react.
Yeah.
And that's what, we conclusively proved with Professor Persinger's testimony in the Lemire case.
Yeah.
That just is not an accurate account. So when the Supreme Court said, yes, the laws do violate free speech, but they're saved or acceptable because the government's trying to deal with a serious problem, what Persinger's testimony pointed out was that it is not a problem. Yeah, nasty comments about your group may upset you or offend you, but surely we don't have a right not to be offended or upset, because I think we'd be upset all the time.
So that should throw out the whole law.
They should throw the whole law. Yeah,
Wow.
It's
So it's a biased law. I guess they're trying to keep the law there just because they're in control. And
that's right. And of course,
Manipulative.
everywhere along the way, it's ideological. The Jews are a vulnerable minority. Well, that's nonsense. They have huge financial, media, political power in Canada. They're not a vulnerable minority. They're a powerful.
You're an oligarchy.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the more recent Supreme Court decisions also said that the homosexuals or the LGBTQXYZ community are a vulnerable minority. Well, how are they vulnerable? They get everything their own way. They've got the same-sex marriage, in many cases, adoption laws to persecute people who disagree with them, government funding, Gay Pride Day, politicians marching in their parade. Well, how are they a vulnerable minority? It's white people who are vulnerable, we're still numerically a majority, and free thinkers. If you have a problem with some of the sacred cows of this society, if you doubt the Hollywood version of World War II, you've got trouble. People who are thinkers are vulnerable.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to pass around this, and there's no water in it, this empty coffee cup. If anything you could throw in for the free speech battle, I would be appreciated. I just want to mention, I will be putting out with Brian a video every day during the trial. So it'll be up on the internet, and we'll give you a quick report of what happened that day.
Yeah.
So anything you can throw in to help with the expenses would be appreciated. Any more questions?
Are they taking the white-owned companies away, like the mining companies?
No, they're not taking. There seems to have been a deal, with the communists because if they were to nationalize the big gold and platinum companies, the economy would completely collapse.
But that seems to be that the elites sort of sell out the more of the working white people. That's happening.
There's a cynical view that the big foreign, big corporations, the big mining companies said, well, okay, regardless of who runs the government, they need us. So they can do whatever they want. Just as long as we can continue to mine.
The wealthy whites are doing okay, but the people that are like middle class and working are the ones that got shut.
That's right. The middle. Well, see, if you're really wealthy, you don't have to go out and work for a job like you could be a lawyer with your own firm. So you don't have to worry about being BEE compliant. You don't really have a company. If you're an engineer, people may hire you. It's basically the middle and the working class whites who suffer, but they're the bulk of the people.
Who's really touched that nerve is he probably might have even met him, Nigel Farage, right? Because he was talking about what has happened to some of the working class towns in northern England.
Yes, that's kind of a different issue, but the same victims, Nigel Farage and UKIP. I saw an interesting figure or argument the other day that said it wasn't just immigration that motivated the vote against the vote in favor of leaving the European Union, Brexit, but the long list of companies that had simply left England for elsewhere with European Union money. So a company that had manufactured something in a city in England for 90 or 100 years suddenly picks up stakes and moves to Spain with a European Union grant. Well, that's maybe great for Spain, not so great for the workers who I mean, this town depended on that business.
They just get the very low cost labor.
Yes.
Right?
And that's something Donald Trump has been addressing in his campaign in the States. The American companies have just simply picked up stakes and moved their manufacturing to Mexico, or to China.
What's Ontario like for manufacturing? You live there, right? So Ontario's not doing well.
Oh, no, Ontario has been seriously devastated by free trade. The manufacturing has taken hit after hit. Yeah, it's not good. Yes?
I wonder, like, it seems like North America's been targeted by, like, the Zionists or the Khazarian Mafia, or whatever you want to call them. And it's, like, by design, right, to destroy the country. I'm wondering if South Africa, if it's the same sort of thing, it's like by design, that they're actually on purpose, like, either, like, intentionally allowing this kind of shift to happen where the destruction of the country is underway, or the people behind these communists, are they like Israelis or Nation of Israel or some other?
Well, there are a lot of people I met who think that the destruction of South Africa is by design. That really goes beyond my book isn't so much a book about history. It's about conditions that are there today. Certainly, South Africa has immense potential, and until about 100 years ago, there was almost an equal number of whites and blacks, and because of mass immigration, and even today, even with official unemployment being about 25% in South Africa, the government continues to allow large numbers of Africans from other countries to pour in. Now, not all the Africans like that. I mean, there have been attacks on some of these people. But in trying to get an explanation for this, I was told that, well, you know, the communist ideology is that, say somebody comes from, let's say, Malawi or from Nigeria. Well, the communist ideology is that we're brothers with different mothers. That's very hard to run a country that way, but that's the communist ideology, and I found that even some whites didn't seem to see, in my opinion, didn't seem to see that this is crazy. I mean, blacks, the unemployment rate in South Africa is 25%, but as with here, although the official figures are way low. Well, why would you want a single other person coming in when your own people don't have enough jobs? Well, thank you very much for coming out, and I do have some interesting books there. That really is saying something. Murders are absolutely out of control in South Africa. Most of the victims, to be fair, are blacks killing blacks, just like what goes on in the United States and in places like where I come from, Toronto. But whites are also frequently the victims, and that's quite a death toll in 22 years. 70,000 whites murdered. Over 3,000 white farmers murdered. And
There's one question.
yes,
In America, aren't there more than that murdered in the same time? Like there's a statistic which claims 14,000 people around that are murdered in America every year.
well, that may be true, but
So if I take that time to 20 years you're talking about, that's 250,000.
although America, of course, is over 300 million people, South Africa's about 60 million. And then when I'm talking about the murders, that's only whites. Now, blacks murder blacks quite frequently in South Africa. So, very considerable pains to protect themselves. It's particularly dangerous in rural areas because often the police, even if they're called, will not arrive for 20 minutes, half an hour, by which time the intruders have murdered, raped, robbed, and moved on. So physical security is in August of this year to complete my research, and I'd be the first one to say I feel a little inadequate because I think a total of 1 month in a country doesn't make you an expert. But I was not there to party or have a good time or visit Kruger National Park or be on the beach or anything like that. It was pretty steady work and interviews, and I was very lucky to have people who organized things for me, who organized good people. I wasn't just blundering down the street asking people their opinions. I was able to talk to a lot of experts, some people who'd been assaulted, other people who knew people who'd been murdered. So I got a lot of good information, and I was able to compare it with my memories of being in South Africa in 1987 under very different conditions. So I'm now feverishly working away on the book. So what did I discover? Well, one of the things well, first of all, some figures. Since 1994, and that's when, under American and British and Canadian pressure, the ruling party of South Africa sold out essentially and turned power over to the communists and the African National Congress. And I'm saying, using those terms deliberately. It was a turnover of power to the communists. The African National Congress has worked closely with the SAPC, that's the South Africa Communist Party, for going back into the 1930s, to be almost the #1 preoccupation of the whites I met. You drive through nice communities. Every place is surrounded by quite a high wall, or just plain fencing and with razor wire on the top, or electrified wire. Most places have some form of surveillance security. They're linked up to a security company. They've got sensors on the windows and the doors. Some have video cameras inside. Security is a major concern for people, even people who live in what we might call gated communities. The problem is, or one problem is, the blacks are everywhere. For reasons that are certainly hard for me to understand and probably hard for you to understand, many whites insist on having blacks do work for them. And that means that they're able to get close to them. Now, the blacks they themselves hire may be honest people, but people talk. And I met one woman who had gone through 10 years of hell and surgeries, and she had been she'd driven up to her home late one afternoon after work, and opened the ground. Anyway, what I'd actually suggested I'd be talking about this afternoon is my recent trip, and it's the second trip in 2 years to South Africa. I'm working on a book for the American Freedom Party called, we don't have a title yet, but the theme is The Ongoing White Genocide in South Africa. Now, that may sound a little over the top. Genocide, you'll say, well, I haven't read in the paper massacres in the streets and so on. And that's true. You haven't. But there's a man named Stanton. He's a liberal. He heads up something called Genocide Watch in Virginia, and he visited South Africa in November of 2014, and he said South Africa is in the 6th of the 7 stages of genocide. In other words, it is the stage before you have people being machine gunned or macheted in the streets. He said there is an organized, ongoing campaign to exterminate the white people there, or to make their living conditions impossible, so that they either accept death or die or leave. Now that comes not from a, whatever you want to call him, a right-winger or a white nationalist, but that comes from a man with very established liberal credentials. So that's really what sparked the interest of the American Freedom Party to send me to South Africa. And I went in May of 2015, and I went again. Unlike almost any other country in the world, other than perhaps Cuba or North Korea or maybe China, the Communist Party is very strong in South Africa. The present Prime Minister, Jacob Zuma, is a communist, a member of the Communist Party. The sainted Nelson Mandela that you would have read about in our papers were just Mandela groupies. Even for, Alberta Premier Alison Redford had gone to South Africa and worked with Mandela. Harper was a big backer of Mandela. Mel Rooney was a big fan. He had a huge reputation, but he was a communist. And he served a lot of time in jail, not because of his political beliefs, but because he'd been involved in organized terrorism. So he was a terrorist. Anyway, so power was handed over to the African National Congress, and essentially that's the Communist Party in South Africa in 1994. From 1994 until today, close to 70,000 whites have been murdered. That is about the number of soldiers the Americans lost in Vietnam. 70,000 in a war that's never been declared. South Africa is one of the most violent countries in terms of murder on earth. It's not the most violent. I think that's Honduras. My God. But it is one of the most violent. I've been told that South Africa is actually more dangerous than Iraq.